5-minute break, and we had Professor Yanya before. Now we will talk about accessible tourism with Professor Zorana Medarić. Um, I hope you enjoy it, and you can ask your questions again. Professor, welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to having me and my colleague Janja here. I also come from the University of Primorska, from the Faculty of Tourism Studies, but I also work at the research center, so I'm kind of a half-half. I'm a sociologist, so I'm interested in all the aspects of social science, research of tourism, and specifically this social tourism, accessible tourism, and so on. Today, I will focus on one specific part of accessible tourism. This is people with mobility disabilities, but this is much wider concept as I will present later. And I want to share with you what we did within our project with students and what were our findings. And through this project, I would like to present some of the concepts related to the accessible tourism. I propose if you have any questions or comments or whatever, you can stop me also in between and we can discuss. Otherwise, I will have this brief presentation and then we have a discussion later, if you agree. Okay, so let's start. What is accessible tourism? I like this first definition because it says that the accessible tourism is ongoing endeavor, which means that we have to work all the time for it to ensure that these different aspects like tourist destination, tourist products, services, all of this is accessible to all people, regardless of their physical limitation, disabilities, or age. So we aim to make tourism accessible to everyone. And this means also encompasses publicly as well as privately owned tourist location, tourist attraction, and so on. Then another definition about accessible tourism, it says that enables people with access requirement, and we will look later who these are. These access requirements include mobility, vision, hearing, cognitive dimensions, but also other aspects to function independently, which is very important, but also with equity and dignity. So these both definitions I mentioned because I think they highlight important aspects of accessible tourism. And one is this ongoing endeavor, and the other is this equity, dignity through the delivery of universally designed tourism products, services, and environments. So this definition is inclusive, again, of all people. It's not targeted especially to some groups of people, but also, for example, those traveling with children, with strollers, people with disabilities, and seniors. Darcy and Dickinson are two of the authors that are very much also concerned with accessibility in tourism. So if you were interested, you can look at them. Here we have these 4 dimensions, 4 concepts actually to understand accessible tourism. I will not go very much into details, but I do think it's important to have some theoretical background to understand also the aspects of accessible tourism. And here are these 4 interdependent concepts. One is type or dimension of disability. We will look later what this is. The second is level of support needs. The third is access enablers. And the fourth is universal design. And for each, I prepared like the small points. So we have to look at the accessibility in these 4 concepts to understand accessible tourism. One is the dimension of disability. We have different dimensions. We immediately usually think about people with mobility disabilities, but it's not only this. Someone has vision problems or hearing or other disabilities like cognitive, learning, mental health also. Then a special aspect is all the sensitivities, including respiratory, food sensitivities, and so on. Then the second is how much support someone needs. Some people with disabilities are independent. They do not need any support. And there is like all this range between low, medium, high, or the ones who need very high support, 24-day support. In tourism, this means that they will also need someone to travel with them when they travel somewhere. They cannot travel independently. Then the third aspect is access enablers. We have now available a lot of assistive technology that can help maximize the abilities of people with disabilities, different wheelchairs, but also like walking frames and so on. Then these are these personal enablers, but it's important also all the others enablers like environmental or structural enablers, ramps, lifts, accessible toilets, accessible parking lots, accessible rooms, as we'll see later, and so on. Another very important aspect in tourism is also attitudes, behaviors of others. And here, as we will see later through our research project, it's also important to sensitize people working in tourism about attitudes towards people with disabilities, how to behave towards them, how to act, not to ignore them, and so on. And the fourth, also very important aspects to think about within the concept of the accessible tourism is universal design. What does it mean that it's universal? It means that this is the design that of products, of environments, or hotels, or any other infrastructure that can be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible. So we don't have to adapt it to the especially for the people with disabilities. So this intent of the universal design concept is actually to simplify the life of everyone. So we try to make as many products, communications, the built environment more usable by more people, or at little or not extra cost. For example, in Slovenia, like now quite some years ago, but our sidewalks, they did not all have the ramps, the access for example, wheelchairs, for people with strollers and so. And I remember in my destination in Portorož, there was a period when they started to build these ramps, so the sidewalks would be more accessible for all people, not only for tourists, and not only for tourists with disabilities. And I'm sure you also have or can have in mind different aspects of changes in your environment. So as I said, the universal design concept targets all people of all ages, sizes, and abilities. Here I have this small, like, funny this note. When this often happens, actually, they say, yes, of course, we have our rooms are accessible, but for example, there is these big stairs that cannot be accessed. And also here you have the example when this guy says, of course, we have wheelchair access, but it's very, very difficult to access in the fact. And the two pictures besides, here the one with the pool and the one with the playground, also show the examples of universal design. So you can use it with the wheelchair or without. Within the concepts of accessible tourism, it's also important to think of tourism as a right for all. This is also, as you see, in 1993, it was also written by the United Nations. that people with disabilities should expect the same rights to citizenship, the same quality of life as the non-disabled, and this definition also includes the rights to travel and participate in leisure activities. So the right to travel should be universal right for all. As we know, and as also it was presented by Anya before, this is not always true. Otherwise, social tourism programs would not be needed. But as an important target, it exists. This is why also in Slovenia we have, as Janja also said before, this allowance for tourism participation. We get, each of us who works or also pensioner people get some money to spend on traveling. So who are the guests with mobility disabilities? As I mentioned also before, if you look at this picture at the right, it says not all disabilities look like this. Some disability looks like this. So some disabilities cannot be visible on the first side. So we have many guests with different forms of mobility disabilities. Some have this physical impairment, like older people, but also there are some people with temporary mobility impairments, which may not be visible at the first sight, with some allergies, with long-term health conditions, and so. And as previously said, some people with disabilities are totally independent, while the others, for example, need help from an assistant or an assistant dog, and so on. So I would like to present, as I said at the beginning, a small project we did with our students. It was funded by our government. It's innovative student projects. And what we did, we wanted to address two problems with a hotel that is accessible, and it's built by how do you say, the Society of Paraplegics in Slovenia. It's hotel, but it's not intended only for people with disabilities. It's intended for all, but it's totally accessible in all aspects. But we identified two problems. This hotel is accessible, but one of the problems they have, that they did not have affordable and detailed information about these adjustments on their, I don't know, web page. So it was difficult to gain the access to the information. So if you have disability and you are not sure whether this room is suitable for you or not, you have to call the hotel and check and so on. So this was one issue we identified together with them. And they also said that it happens, and it's, as I previously said, it's important for tourism workers to be sensitized how to work with physically impaired people. Some people have negative attitudes, how some people don't know how to act. And it's important for tourism workers to gain knowledge about how to address people with disability and how you can help them, how you can talk to them. So we addressed these two issues in two ways. One was, of course, theoretically we are academics, and the others, we went to this accessible hotel and we talked with guests. We make interviews with guests with mobility disabilities, and we ask them, what are the barriers to participation in tourism? Why, for example, maybe in some ways they do not participate in tourism, or what impairs them from participation in tourism? And the other questions, or the other topic we addressed, was their experiences with tourism participation. And this is our group. We were a different group of students. Some students were from tourism studies, but others were also of healthcare studies. And we also have a special mentor from this accessible hotel, who we work together with. As you can see, also Professor Janja is together. We are working on similar topics. So what we found out about the barriers to participation in tourism. As Janja also mentioned in her presentation, one of important barriers, there are three types of barriers. First, one are intrinsic, the other are environmental, and the third is communication. And intrinsic is the internal barriers we have before we go maybe on a trip. It's maybe, it says it's deriving from our own cognitive, physical, psychological function. It's maybe the fear of traveling. We think about the possible problems we might have on the travel and then decide in advance we maybe don't want to travel, we are afraid to travel and so on. The other is environmental barriers. These are this construction limitation, infrastructure limitation. These are what are externally imposed limitations. And the third is, as I already said before, it's the interaction between the tourist and their environment. It's communication. All the three barriers are important to address if we want to have people with disabilities coming to our tourist destination. So we asked this question to the guests with disabilities, and we wanted to address their fears, and we wanted to try to answer the fears. So they are asking themselves, for example, these three questions. Is accommodation accessible? Will I be treated equally as other guests? Will they treat me differently? Will they ignore me maybe? And they are also oftentimes afraid they will be a burden to someone. So they don't want to be a burden to someone. They want to feel like they are welcome but not annoying, for example, other, I don't know, guests or tourist workers and so on. As I said, this accessibility of accommodation is very important, and it's important to have as many information as possible before the travel. Within this project, we had the privilege that sorry, I hear some noise.
I guess I fixed it.
It's okay. Okay. Sorry, yeah, I couldn't hear. So we had the privilege to have a very interesting lecture from a lady with disabilities who travels a lot around the world, and she came and had the lecture for our students and described how she travels, what does she do before the travel, how important are different things on the travel. And one of the things she stressed is that it's really important to have as many information as possible before the travel. Many times we see on Booking, on other sites, our accommodation is available, or you can see the sign that it's for people with disabilities. But she said that in practice, many of these are not really accessible. What does it mean to be accessible? Besides having all this information as possible, these points are very important. Accessible parking lot, because a lot of times people travel with their own cars, and it's important to have an accessible parking. Unobstructed access from the parking to the accommodation. What we learned when we had this lecture from this person, when she came to our university, which is very newly built, our building where we have our tourism studies in, it has lift, it's very wide access everywhere, but we did not notice before there is a small step before you come inside to our faculty. So she had difficulties overcoming these insights. We were not aware that our faculty is in fact not so easily accessible as we thought it was. So it's important to have this unobstructed access from the parking to the accommodation. Then, for example, accessibility of the reception, to have door wide enough, to have desk, that it's usually, you remember how this reception desk look. There is this big desk and the person behind the counter. And if you're, for example, on a wheelchair, you look from below, you don't see someone directly. So you can have these two heights counters. Then room suitability, that the door is wide enough, there is room, to move around with a wheelchair, accessibility of switches, table heights, and so on. We looked also at the bathroom suitability, if there are, for example, hand holders, and many small aspects which make the life of someone with disability easier, but can be also interesting and fun to use for other people, not necessarily with disabilities, for all. There is like small things you can have to make your accommodation more accessible, like portable ramps, shower chairs, and so on. But also it's maybe important to have a lift, which is also wide enough for a wheelchair. And then to think about whether you want to allow pet animals welcome or not, and so on. This is one quote from the person we talked to. When we ask what can a hotel do, what small changes can they implement if they want to make things more accessible for them, they say they can, if you have, I don't know, 2-3 stairs, it's really cheap to purchase a portable ramp. It's not expensive. It's a ramp you put only if there's someone that needs it, and otherwise you can really have it stored nicely and you don't even know it's there, and it's really cheap and it makes someone's lives so much easier. What we did within these student projects, we looked at each room, at each bathroom, and we prepared such accessible information for them so they can put it on the internet, on their website, so everyone who looks at this accommodation immediately finds all the information. How wide are these spaces? How is the mirror height? You can see all these aspects. This is one of the rooms, which is very accessible, which has wide door, which has enough space, to move around, adjustable bed, and many other things. So we prepared this kind of information so they can use in a hotel and put it on the website to improve one of the important aspects of accessibility, which is information accessibility. Here is the bathroom. Similarly, we prepared all this information about the sliding door, mirror, everything, and also any other appliances they might have. They can also simply bring additionally to if some guests need it. You can see that's, I don't know, roll-in shower, different heights, different shelves, accessibility of switches and sockets, and so on. This was one question we tried to answer. So, will the accommodation be accessible, and so on. The other is, will I be treated equally? We have to pay attention to people with, I don't know, accessibility problems, but to people as people, not to their specific physical obstruction. They want to be treated as equally as possible. So, for example, it happens, and they also stressed it, that if they are accompanied by someone, by an assistant, Sometimes the staff talks to the assistant as they would not be, I don't know, able to answer themselves. But yes, it's maybe self-obvious, but not for everyone, that it's important to speak directly to them. To not treat them as victims. They may not feel as victims themselves, to not avoid eye contact, to not lean into the wheelchair, touch into the wheelchair or so on, because this is also part of their personal space. And then also to have in mind that sometimes they would need more space, more time to move or something. On one hand, but on the other hand, also be sensible not to underestimate their abilities. If they want to do something on their own, they usually want to do it, and they can do it as much as possible. It's important also not to touch, move, or remove some if they have crutches or stick, because they need it for, I don't know, for moving around. So not to move them without their permission and so on. And what they stressed, and what we think is very important, is that the attitude of staff can compensate for many deficiencies and problems. Even if the accommodation is not so accessible, or there are some obstructions, if the staff is friendly, willing to help, and has a nice attitude, this compensates for many deficiencies. And this was also what we found from quotes from our discussions with people with disabilities as guests. They, for example, this is one quote: "I like the friendly cultural attitude of the tourist staff, also their kind greetings. I want to be independent, to do as much as possible myself." And the third question we try to answer is, will I be burdened to someone? As previously said, guests with disabilities do not all have the same needs. Some, I don't know, can do some steps on their own. Some may need additional help opening the door, climbing stairs. As a staff, it's important to not ignore them, to offer help. Let them know that you're ready to help in case they need help. And if you see the same guest over and over again, then if you know that he needs help opening the door, maybe you can do it yourself, not needs for them to ask for your help every time. Okay, if they have problems with movement but are not on a wheelchair, you can offer them to help to sit and so on. To move some furniture is necessary, to assist in, I don't know, with their coats, opening the door and so on. Don't be afraid to ask what they need. I think this is one of the most important aspects that came out of these interesting talks we had with them. And this is also another quote: "There are no stupid questions, nothing is foolish, do not be embarrassed to ask. I will tell you, I need to do this, or I do not need anything, thank you. And it's easier and faster, and I will feel better, and we will sort out everything if you ask me, and I'll tell you. Instead, I may say to myself, nobody did not even look at me. I'm waiting here like I have a disease or something for this coffee." Sometimes, as I said, staff is just embarrassed, don't know how to act and so on. So they say, let's talk, dialogue is the key here. Okay, since we are approaching to the end, I wanted to just make some examples of good practice. You may know, probably know this chain of Scandinavian hotels, and they have very good accessibility practice. You can check also on their website, or if they are if you're interested, they have some short movie about how they change their hotels. They have accessibility information at each hotel, everything, how far is the disabled parking, how wide are the doors, everything. you will find all the detailed information about their own solutions, because they, as a part of the chain, were encouraged to implement small, easy solutions, like I mentioned before, like purchasing a ramp or having a two heights counter and so on. Under special needs, you get all this information. And I said, with this smart solution, they design hotels where all their guests can be happy. Some technical solutions, some practical matters, and so on. They also have, which is very important as a part of the chain, this accessibility standard. And they consulted with the Organization for People with Special Accessibility Needs. They have drawn up a checklist of as much as 135 points. When there is, each hotel can check which of these accessibility standards they offer, and they should make a change towards it. And they also have, which is also very important, an online training in accessibility that advises, tips, tests, and have different videos how to provide really good service for guests with disabilities. So as they see, it's important to have a high level of service to all guests, with or without disabilities. And now, since we are almost at the end, I hope you're still with me. I have two questions for students. And one is, how accessible is your faculty, if you think about it? If you think in terms of people with mobility disabilities or mobility impairments. And the other is, if you think about your destination, how would you rate the accessibility of the destination? And thank you for listening. And if you have other questions, you can ask me. But before that, maybe you can answer to my questions, students.
Thank you so much. So let's start with the first question, the accessibility of the faculty. Okay, is there anyone who would like to answer? Maybe as they are thinking, maybe I can give an example to parking lot, because there is a place reserved for people with accessibility. I mean, the picture is about the wheelchair, people with moving disabilities, basically. And we have a ramp in front of the building, which one can be dangerous in rainy days, even for us. Really. I usually do not use that place. I use regular stairs. We have elevators with the sounds. I mean, you hear which floor you are. And as far as I know, we have a student with a blind student. So he survives. I mean, I personally didn't talk to the student, but I know that he is older than the previous student. So maybe he was looking for the right time, because we have a huge campus, a huge area. So we have the space. I mean, we are lucky about this, because we are out of the city center.
Yes, yes.
This is why we have space. But other universities may not have them at all.
This is to think in terms of this universal design, and I think this is very much incorporated in nowadays architecture, so it's part of the standards. But still, yeah, it's important to, as I said, we did not notice that our faculty is not so accessible as we thought. In the case of that Barbara, no, who had the presentation, and she had difficulties coming up this small step, you don't even notice if you walk like this.
So the best way would be directly asking them, maybe experiencing them, asking them to visit your campus and leave the problems by themselves to get the right feedback.
Yes, this is what we had in mind, to organize a small project with students, maybe for the next years. So they will go together with some people, I don't know, on a wheelchair, someone on a wheelchair, and check the accessibility, the real accessibility of the hotels, of the destination. And so this is our idea for the next research projects.
So maybe I can keep on, because please raise your hands if you have any questions.
Maybe it's difficult to listen to two in a row.
It was a long,
lectures.
it was a long course, but both of them are a part of our lives, and I mean all of us, some relatives who has some disability problems. I mean not maybe mobility, but other types of problems, and I guess we are all aware that they are really afraid of the society, afraid what they will face when they go out, even to the market. And the space is important for a restaurant maybe, because usually the restaurants have a narrow space and the tables are so close to each other, even you cannot move through it. So leaving a wide space for someone with a wheelchair may require less consumers, less visitors. So this is not about only making the money. This is about showing some responsibility for them, showing some respect, which would be appreciated by the society, I believe. But we are a little bit of lack of this awareness, I guess.
Yeah, it goes, I think it comes slowly, and also with the implementation of these standards that are necessities. As I said, when building, now you're obliged maybe to do something to make your I don't know, hotel more accessible and so on. So through time we will make these changes, and through raising the awareness about this.
Maybe for the hotels, we used to have a study about hotels' websites, just to see if they are announcing their facilities are enough for the people with mobility disabilities. Actually, they claim that they have accessible rooms, but they don't give any details. So we don't know what's going on there. And I guess the way that they claim they have accessible rooms, it is mostly about people with mobility disabilities. I mean, there are different versions of disabilities, but the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, we have wide space, we have a wide door, so we have an accessible room. But there are so many details, as you expressed in your presentation. So are they really accessible? I mean, they claim that they are, but are they really? I don't know.
Sometimes also the access to the room is difficult, maybe it's a good room with enough space and everything, but the access to the room, it's maybe then actually not accessible. Or they said sometimes they had to go from, I don't know, somewhere behind, not like a normal front door, but service door or something, from behind. So different different versions.
Yes.
Can I comment? Can I have one comment? Zorana exposed one very important issue, not just one, many of them. And one really important one is that physical accessibility has equal importance as, let's say, attitude. So it's not about physical accessibility is the first, the most important issue, and attitude comes second, but they are equally important. So if you are accessible but not friendly, it doesn't help you or help those people. And vice versa. If you are welcoming but not accessible, you cannot overcome all the barriers. And one important thing there is also, Zorana mentioned, is about different levels of accessibility. Not all of the tourism providers are enjoy the same level of accessibility. That's why the information about accessibility and accessibility, let's say, characteristics are important in order that our client, our tourist, can decide and check and recognize those accessible characteristics. And if this characteristic suits him, then it's okay. So accessibility, it's not just one level or zero level, it's in between. And if you provide good information, tourists can decide which tourism provider is enough accessible for them and their needs. Do you understand? So it is important that we introduce our accessibility, even if we think that we are just 10% accessible. Maybe this is enough for some senior or family. If you have this information available, people can decide if you are accessible enough. And really, as Zorana stressed out, it is important to put this information into the world on the website, because these people plan their holidays in advance, a lot of time in advance. So it is important that the information is there.
So claiming that you have an accessible room or accessible facility may require the details so that you know if you fix the situation. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, any questions? Anyone?
Actually, I have one. Do
Professor?
you hear me well?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. This was very interesting, Zorana, and I think both lectures somehow converge, you know, on the point of accessibility somehow, accessibility in many ways. I'm just curious. I'm sure you have monitored or observed touristic enterprises both in your country and elsewhere. What is the most often cited excuse for not having these physical improvements for disabled people?
What is the excuse, Diana? Maybe you can also comment if you.
Yes, I have a
What's
few
your impression? I'm
excuses.
curious.
Yeah, a few excuses. We have in Slovenian coast, we have a very nice old town called Piran. And it is, you know, the streets are very narrow, the buildings are very old, the floor are from the stones, very difficult for the people on the wheelchairs. And with the students, we went there and asked tourism providers, what are the reasons that Piran is not more accessible? And a lot of them, not all of them, said that this is a cultural city, that it is under the, how do you say, cultural protection. Yeah, so they cannot change anything. This is forbidden, you know. They will ruin the old city and all the, you know, the features of this old city. This is one very common excuse, that we cannot do this because this is a special cultural heritage, and these, let's say, ramps and so on will ruin the city. Another very common excuse is, oh, nobody asked for this, let's say, special things or let's say services and so on, because we really don't see a lot of people on wheelchairs in Piran. Why should we provide services for such clients? Small group, because actually the destination is not adapted or accommodate or let's say it doesn't think about these clients, actually they cannot come. So it is interconnected. If you don't care about them, they will not come. If you care about them, you can become an accessible destination, and this is your, let's say, advantage as a business advantage. The most accessible destination in Slovenia, please come. Nah? So another excuse in this area is also these people, they don't have money, they don't travel. So as Zorana mentioned before, this is a small target group. But it is really not the case, because according to one lecture, it was a professor from I don't know which Scandinavian country. She mentioned that this is a very profitable group because they come in pairs, you know. Usually it comes one person with a person who accompany this person. So it is two-person travel, let's say, instead of one. And many other excuses. I don't have them now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janja.
Thank you for the question, Professor Dinç. Anyone else? Well, I think treating with dignity and equity is such important, and I don't know if we personally, I also know how to do it right. We would like to ask if they need anything, but we are afraid if we are reaching them in a correct way, if they feel themselves weird. So it is a real balance, and we should be maybe asking more questions as, what do you need? Which was nice, really. And we have a long way to go, I assume. So if there are no questions, I guess this is the end of the meeting. I have to finish the meeting. Thank you so much for being here, for giving us so precious information about social tourism and accessible tourism. My students, the students who are taking this course will just make a connection between ethics and these subjects, which will be so important for us. And I hope you enjoyed it. We personally so enjoyed your presentations. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evla, for your hospitality, and all the students also. Thank you for listening.
Thank you from my
Hope
side
to
too.
see you, and I would like to invite you, Evla, and your students and your colleagues to visit our faculty when possible, as soon as possible. We will be happy to have you there in person.
We would love to. Same for us too. I hope this pandemic ends as soon as possible and we meet each other.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Janja, Zorana, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your presentations. I missed Zorana's presentation. Sorry, I had a lecture.
Yes.
Thank
No
you very
worries.
much.
We had the recording.
Thank you. See you in Turkey.
See you.
Thank you.